What composes the judicial branch? Supreme Court. Yes. It's the Supreme Court, and it's also the lower courts, the circuit courts. But at its highest level, this is the Supreme Court. What is the legislative branch? This is Congress. Again, to simplify, it's composed of the Senate and the House. So this is where we would need to look to see things happen in 2014. We'll begin with discussing this judicial branch, but to explain the judicial branch, I have to begin with the legislative. So just one point about the legislative. Because if you want to appoint people to the Supreme Court, where does it have to go through? This branch. So just to begin on the legislative, 2014 is a midterm election. And what happens at that midterm election? Quoting from CNN, a Republican tide ripped the Senate away from Democrats Tuesday, giving the Republican Party full control of Congress and the power to pin down President Barack Obama during his last 2 years in office. The thumping win upends the balance of power between the White House and Capitol Hill only 6 years after Obama's Democrats swept to power. In the House, CNN projected the Republican Party will have at least 246 seats, its largest majority since World War II. So what happens in the midterm election in Congress? There is a historic sweep of both the Senate and the House, and the Republicans gain a vice-like grip on both. In the House, the largest Republican majority since World War II. So what's going to happen now it's going to impact both branches of government in Obama's 2 final years as president. So I want to take a step back now, and I want to discuss I want to step back and discuss the Federalist Society. Now, I don't want to spend a long time on this, so I won't. I'll try and give an overview of what some of the research says. We'll have put on the media broadcast later some key articles if you wish to look further into what the Federalist Society is. But for now, I'll just try and give a brief overview. The Federalist Society. In November 15, 2007, nearly 2,000 people filled the Great Hall of Washington's cavernous Union Station for a black tie celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Federalist Society. It was started in 1982. President George W. Bush attended. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, sent a video salute. 3 other sitting justices, Antonin Scalia, Clarence Thomas, and Samuel Alito, appeared in person to pay tribute. So you have 4 justices of the Supreme Court, and you have the sitting US President. Scalia and Thomas spoke about the group's origins, a story that is critical to its mythology. The Federalist Society was founded in 1982 by 3 law students at the University of Chicago and at Yale. Scalia was the group's first faculty advisor at Chicago, where he was then a professor. The advisor at Yale was Robert Bork, who was later nominated to the Supreme Court by Ronald Reagan. So it begins at the University of Chicago and at the University of Yale. In Chicago, it was Antonin Scalia, who later became part of the Supreme Court. At Yale, it's Robert Bork, who was nominated for the Supreme Court by Reagan, but was not placed there. As the Federalists see it, the Society's founders were scrappy outsiders who were waging a lonely struggle against the pervasive liberalism of America's law schools. Scalia said at the anniversary party, "We thought we were just planting a wildflower among the weeds of academic liberalism, and it turned out to be an oak." Elaborating on this point, Thomas said, "I look at this huge audience and I can only imagine the courage of a few young people who came up with yet one more idea. Let's start something. Let's start an organization where we can actually talk about ideas." Within a few years, the group was embraced and funded by a number of powerful, wealthy, conservative organizations, which eventually included foundations associated with John Olin, Linda and Harry Bradley, Richard Scaife, and the Koch brothers. The funders all got the right idea right away. I'm quoting Amanda Hollis-Brusky, a professor of politics at Pomona College and the author of Ideas with Consequence, a study of the Federalist Society. She says, "The funders got the idea right away that you can win elections, you can have mass mobilizations, but unless you can change elites and the institutions that are by and large controlled by the elites, like the courts in America, there are limits to what you can do." The idea was to train, credential, and socialize a generation of alternative elites. In the late 80s, the Federalist Society was known primarily as an organization for law students, with few opportunities for members to stay involved after they left school. But now we introduce another fellow, Leonard Leo. He becomes important. Leonard Leo. Leo founded the Federalist chapter at Cornell Law School before he graduated in 1989, but then decamped for DC. When I was quoting Leonard Leo, "When I was in the midst of my clerkship, the Society came to me and said, 'Hey, we're not sure the Lawyers Division of the Federalist Society is working, so would you be interested in coming to work for us?' And Leo started at the Society in 1991. Leo set himself a clear goal. The key was to figure out how to develop what I call a pipeline." That's quoting him. He wanted to develop a pipeline where you have these alternative conservative lawyers being trained up in these law schools and create a pipeline where you can get them into key positions in the legislative branch. Quoting Stephen Tells, a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University and the author of The Rise of the Conservative Legal Movement, he says, it's not a hierarchy. Federalist Society is not a hierarchy, it's a network with at its center Leonard Leo. The Federalist Society was in 2008, after the election of Barack Obama, their convention was a downbeat affair. not least because the outgoing George Bush's Attorney General gave a speech at the Federalist Society Convention and passed out mid-speech. It wasn't a very happy year for them, partly because of this issue internally, partly, largely, because of the election of Barack Obama. This was not the outcome the Federalist Society was designing. The article that will be posted later on the media broadcast, so I won't go through all the steps, but it describes George W. Bush trying to get conservative judges appointed to the Supreme Court and key spots in the lower courts. And you have these people, one Alberto Gonzales. He comes to Washington, he's an outsider, he's a strong conservative, but he isn't part of the Federalist Society, and George Bush tries to appoint him to the Supreme Court. And what does the Federalist Society say? We're not going to let that happen. They launch a campaign to block it. He's conservative, but he's not one of them. That gets blocked. Next, George Bush, 2005, chooses Harriet Miers, another conservative, to join the Supreme Court. What does the Federalist Society say? She might be conservative. We don't care. She's not one of us. She's not a member of the Federalist Society. We don't know her. However conservative is, we're blocking it. So they launch a campaign against her. It's so intense, she withdraws her own nomination after 1 month. Republicans quickly understand that if they want judges, if they want to influence the judicial branch, they have to work with the Federalist Society. So you come 2008, it's a sad year for them, Barack Obama. We go through those successive years. We'll come back to 2014. I want to go to 2016. Donald Trump is running for President of the United States. At this point, he's only running to be the Republican nominee. He hasn't yet had it. But he needs the conservative vote. And one of the attacks that Donald Trump is receiving is from these others, people like Marco Rubio, standing up in debates and saying, who is this Donald Trump? You don't know that he's that conservative. He's given money to the Clintons before, funded the Democrats. He's been a Democrat before. There is likely going to be Supreme Court positions open up within the next presidential term. Do you really want to trust Donald Trump with appointing Supreme Court justices? You can't be sure that he's conservative enough. So Donald Trump is under attack for not being conservative enough. So he does a very key tactical move. He reaches out to Leonard Leo. He says, come meet with me. And the two meet in 2016 at the law firm's offices in Washington. Trump was getting closer to getting the Republican nomination, but because of his political history funding Democrats, people were wary. So what he did is he went to Leonard Leo, who was at this stage, I believe he was the vice president of the Federalist Society, and he said, what I want to do, what I, Donald Trump, want to do is you create a list for me of all of the judges that the Federalist Society want appointed to the Supreme Court, to the judicial system. You give me your dream list, and I'll stand on TV and say, I have this list, everyone can read it, of the judges that I will appoint to the judicial branch. So what he does is he hands all that power to Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society. Leonard Leo then writes Donald Trump that list. He writes Trump a list of all of the judges the Federalist Society would approve of, the most extreme, the most conservative, that over the last over 30 years now, they had been preparing and training up. Quoting Leonard Leo, no campaign on history had put out such a list. He said to Trump, that's a great idea. You're creating a brand. He then discusses how he formed this list with Donald Trump. On May 18th, 2016, Trump released Leo's list of 11 judges as his possible nominees, 11 key judges. In September, Trump put out another 10 names. Now he has 21, in a group that included Neil Gorsuch, who was later nominated and placed on the Supreme Court. Of the Supreme Court as it stands now, you have 9 judges. 5 of them are members or former members of the Federalist Society. So they've now got a majority of their own people, their own people that they had seen, trained up, prepped, worked with, put through that pipeline straight onto the Supreme Court. 5 out of 9. One of those was the name given to Donald Trump, Neil Gorsuch. But those other 21 names, it hasn't stopped there. It's been through not just the Supreme Court, but the judicial branch. Democrats have not paid enough attention to this branch of the US government. They don't see the significance of the courts in the same way the Republican Party does. They began to take notice of it in 2001 when you had the Supreme Court's decision handed the presidency to George W. Bush, the Republican nominee. Then they started to see the power the Supreme Court had when it chose the president. And prophecy tells us the Supreme Court made the right decision or the wrong decision. The wrong decision. But they handed it to the Republican. May 21st, 2019, the Washington Post puts out a short documentary, it's about 21 minutes, titled The Conservative Movement Transforming America's Courts. It's all based on the Federalist Society. In that, Leonard Leo is interviewed, he speaks. His executive vice president, he says, "What you are seeing now is the culmination of over 30 years of work. I was here long before this president, and I'll be doing what I'm doing, God willing, long after." January 2019, the Washington Post magazine wrote that the Federalist Society has reached an unprecedented peak of power and influence. Of the 9 members of the Supreme Court, 5 are current or former members of the Federalist Society. Brett Kavanaugh, appointed by Trump, on the list. Neil Gorsuch, appointed by Trump, on the list. Clarence Thomas, John Roberts, Samuel Alito. Politico magazine wrote that the Federalist Society has become one of the most influential legal organizations in history, not only shaping law students' thinking, but changing American society itself by deliberately, diligently shifting the country's judiciary to the right. Quoting Donald Trump, "You put the wrong justices on the Supreme Court, and this country will never ever be the same again." So this is not something that happened in a vacuum. And we didn't want to discuss 2016. It began in 2014 because Mitch McConnell, when the Republican Party took greater control of the House to what it's ever had since World War II, when it had that historic takeover of Congress, what power did that give to Mitch McConnell? From 2014, every time Obama tries to appoint a judge to the judiciary, what are the Republicans going to do? Whether it's lower courts or Supreme Courts, they're going to block that appointment. And when you come to When you come to 2016, all they were waiting for was a president who could fill those places with conservative Federalist Society judges. Mitch McConnell says that this is the most significant thing he has ever done in his entire political career. because he understands the significance of what the steps he began in 2014 led to. So this began in 2014. This is Mitch McConnell, a Republican-controlled Congress, now blocking Obama from filling any of those positions that had vacated. There was a historic void in the judiciary branch by the time that Trump came to power. So much so that now it is now a Republican, heavily Republican bent branch. We only have a couple of minutes left, so I'll just remind us of the legislative. We know they took Congress, but now what was happening inside the Republican Party was similar to what you see the Democrats now. There's a fight within the Democratic Party between those who are seen as extremists, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, that branch, and the Bidens, essentially, the centrists. You have this split. That's what happened in the Republican Party in 2014. You had the extremists, and you had the centrists. And this again was a planned attack in 2012 by Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, and Jeff Sessions. I referenced last week the Zero Tolerance documentary by Frontline. In 2014, Mr. Bannon jumped from the political sidelines into the arena when a little-known Republican candidate named David Brat challenged Eric Cantor. Mr. Brat's victory stunned Republican elders. It was a foretaste of the white-hot movement Mr. Trump would soon lead. One of the most stunning primary election upsets in congressional history. And what was Eric Cantor? So this is the toppling of Eric Cantor. Why did Steve Bannon want Eric Cantor out? Why did Stephen Miller want Eric Cantor out? He's seen as a centrist compromising with Obama. What was Eric Cantor compromising on for the Republicans? Immigration. Eric Cantor was not strong enough in their view on immigration. So this whole issue in the Republican Party was centered around the subject of immigration. So I'm just going to summarize. We may have a quick look at that next week before we move on. But I just don't want us to lose the point of what we're doing. 2014 is two things. It is the Sunday law for the priests. You would look and expect to see the actions in the legislative branch and the judicial branch. Why can't we see it in 2014? Two problems. First of all, we're on the wrong side. We're looking to the executive, to Obama, to do that work because we don't like Obama. We don't like those Clinton globalist, UN conspiring so-called deep state. That's our first problem. What is our second? We're looking for a Sabbath Sunday issue. What was the issue with this legislative branch in 2014? Did they not like Eric Cantor because he is against Sunday legislation? No, they don't like him because he's willing to compromise on immigration. This is all about equality. And we also can't see that in 2014. We had to have the latter rain to explain to us 2014. It isn't a mistake of this movement that we went through 2014 and didn't see it. We are not responsible for light that God has not yet given to us. Does that mean that we had the license to reject 2014 as the waymark? No. Even with what we couldn't explain, we had to accept it based on the structure, and it became a life and death testing message to recognize 2014 as the Sunday law, the Sunday law for the priests. We could not reject it because of what we didn't understand. We are only understanding it more completely 6 years later because of the light of the latter rain and the increase of knowledge of the Sunday law, Daniel 11:41. As we understand better this, it's natural we look back and understand better 2014. It's two things: the concrete Sunday law for the priests. But what happened here? By the time we get to Daniel 11:41, we'll be able to look back and see that's the steps that led us to here. What took place in 2014 changed the judicial courts for a generation. If there was ever going to be another generation, and we know they won't, they might be able to undo the damage of 2014. But we know that there is no new generation, therefore the damage is irreversible. The legislative. What happened within the Republican Party? That purging that was the first sign that led to Donald Trump. That has changed the Republican Party in a way it will never recover from. So 2014 fits the legislative branch, the judicial branch. We cannot look to Obama and the executive branch. We cannot look for a Sabbath Sunday issue. It's about immigration and racism, nationalism. 2014 does not become, we don't look back and see and lose faith at God, how God has led us as we understand it better. Instead, our faith should grow. Our faith is growing because as knowledge increases, it doesn't look back and diminish the Time of the End magazine. It doesn't go back and diminish 2012. Instead, we expand upon it and we see it in even more glory than it was then. But we should have the warning of 2012. Can we wait for all the information to decide whether we accept or reject? No. It's life and death to hold on to the cause and the structure, even when we don't have all of our questions answered. We're here. We have much more to learn about the Sunday law. We are far from arrived understanding that waymark, but we are well on our way to having 41 expand the same way verse 40 did. That should increase our faith. We should be excited to see what we still have to learn and unlearn. That process should excite us. We are coming to the point where we will understand 34 AD, but it can't be understood in a vacuum. So I wanted to put this in place before we move on with Millerite history, but because it becomes inevitable that as we advance, we learn and unlearn, and we should be careful that we don't forget how God led in our past history. If we forget how He opened up verse 40, we will struggle to accept how He is opening up verse 41 and all of the subjects around verse 41. Verse 41, we call it a Sunday law because that is what Adventism recognizes. It becomes a symbol. But this is the waymark when the United States speaks as a dragon. It is all to do with external events in the United States. So we should expect to both learn and unlearn. And my hope is that for each one of us, that grows our faith, it does not shrink our faith. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer, and then we'll take just a couple of questions before we close finally. If you'll kneel with me. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Thank you for how you have led in our past history. We look back and we see 2012 and what you opened up to us, and how much it is growing, how much it still has yet to grow. I pray that we will be excited by this progress, that it will not discourage us, that it will not cause us to doubt the truth of your leading and of your messages, as we find that in this growth process, our old understandings are too simplistic for what we now need to absorb. I pray, Lord, that you will encourage those that are struggling. We know it is a difficult time period right now, and this is feeding the doubts and the fears. Oh Lord, we've been through much the last 18 months. May we not lose our grip on not just any of those messages, but also in our understanding of how you have been faithful and led. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Someone asked, since the legislative and judicial branches can bring in the Sunday law without the executive branch, the view that Trump is the last president may not hold true. So we have this study of the last president, and my question would be, last president of what? Last president of what kingdom? This is where we need to understand that our prior understanding is too simplistic. We had that study come out in 2016 at the same time as we're in an increase of knowledge that's going to bring us to the King of the North and the King of the South that culminates in September 2018. And what was the point of the message in September of 2018? Come November 9, 2019, what's the problem with the United States? You can already mark it there on a fractal level. You no longer have a republic. From November 9 on the fractal of the priests, you don't have a republic after November 9. So as we look at the study of the last president, I would suggest that we need to expect an increase of knowledge. Someone has asked before, so I have two questions now. I'll answer both of these and then we'll close. One of them is private. Someone has asked, why do we call it the Sunday law when it is not about Sunday? Elder Parminder answered this really well in, I think it was either a class or a presentation, and I'm not really sure where that was. And I remember him explaining that, and I know I'm not going to do it the same way or the same justice. I don't have it in my mind now or in the way that he explained it. So if anyone remembers that and has a link to where he addressed that, if you could please post it. The question was asked privately, so you will not be able to reach out to this person, but perhaps this individual may reach out to others. So I'll just try and give it how I see it, which I think is in agreement with what Elder Parminder said. What else are we going to call it? Really, it's, if we were to go to the Levites and back to the church, we're going to end up stuck. When we're going to talk about this waymark, and Adventism will have no idea what we're talking about. Adventism, when you say the Sunday law, they recognize what waymark you're talking about when you say those words. So that's why I put it in little parentheses, because I'm treating it as a symbol, not as a Sunday law, but that is the symbol you take to that waymark. The problem with Adventism is we've been on this journey of Adventism for a long time, 200-something years. My math brain has gone long ago, but we've been on this journey a long time, and Adventism has been through many waymarks. It's been through 1844, 1850, 1863. We've kind of been going step by step through many waymarks, and for many Adventists today, if they're standing here and you're Adventist today, they don't understand 1989. They don't understand a new reform line. So the last waymark that they have to go back to look to and hold on to, is a waymark that's about 130 years ago. So they go back here. It's over 130 years since 1888 and those Sunday law movements. But what else have they got to hold on to or grip onto? It becomes reasonable that they're going to take the last, if you're on monkey bars, you hold on to the last one you've got. They don't have anything else. They don't understand 1850. Even if they did, that's past history. This is the last thing that they have. So if we're going to be able to explain this message to Adventists, we need to be able to help them understand 1888, that they shouldn't be looking here. They need to see a new reform line. And when they do that, you put 1888 back in its context, which is 1 plus 2 equals 3. 1850, 1888. It takes on the same characteristics as 1850, a symbol. So if we're going to be able to do that for the Levites, for the church, if we were to take that Sunday law waymark and remake it, the first problem we have is we don't actually understand that waymark very well yet. We can call it equality, but that's a poor, very broad term. We're here. We need to be careful that we don't get into the trap of thinking we understand equality, therefore we have the Sunday law figured out. If we did, we'd be here already. So we don't have a proper term to call this yet, and between here and here, between 2021 and the Sunday law, what's our job description? What is this dispensation? It's the harvest for who? The Levites. So of course the message of the Sunday law has to be formalized here, because what message are we going to bring to the Levites? We're going to tell them, next waymark is the Sunday law. You better get ready. So we haven't even reached this formalized message. We don't even have a formalized message to take back to the church about the Sunday law. As soon as we do, we're ready for duty. So we can't just say equality. It's not precise. It's not formalized. And when we go back to the church, the problem that we're going to face is, if we say just a different term for this waymark, none of these people will have any anchoring to know what we're doing or what we're talking about. So it becomes necessary to keep using that term in context, saying it's a symbol, if that makes sense. Last question. There was a question back that was the next one asked, so I'll go with that. I don't want to give a brief answer to that. It's Brother Raymond. Elder Tess, can you see a pattern in terms of external, internal, in erasing history, tearing down statues, tearing down waymarks? Yes, that's my answer. You can see that pattern, but I might go into further detail on that at another time. So, Brother Jeffrey asked, we mark the increase of knowledge of the dispensation 1989 to 9/11 as reform lines and formalization. So increase of knowledge. 91, this is reform lines. Formalization, Daniel 11:40 to 45. I'll just write Daniel 11 for space. Do you mind explaining how the increase of knowledge was the reform lines again? Thanks. It was the very first thing given to this movement. if you were here 2 weeks ago, we put up on the screen share the end of ancient Israel overlaid with the end of modern Israel. And we saw how those reform lines give us an explanation of the one that we're currently in. It's the absolute foundation of everything that this movement has and believes and teaches. All of our present truth becomes built upon reform lines. So the first thing that Elder Jeff was given was an understanding of reform lines, that there are 4 key histories where God is going to do a work of reform within his people. You have beginning of Alpha of ancient, Omega of ancient, Alpha of modern. If you have those reform lines, then it starts to suggest that, or explain Daniel 11:40 Part B, 1798, the beginning of the Alpha history of modern Israel, Daniel 11:40 Part A. Now we're doing 11:40 Part B, 1989. So even Daniel 11:40 is built on reform lines, seeing 1798 begins a reform line, raising up of a messenger, giving of the first angel's message, unsealing of the book of Daniel. 1989 begins Omega of modern Israel, raising up of a reformer, unsealing of the book of Daniel. 11:40 Part A, 11:40 Part B. So I might not be answering your question sufficiently. I'm sorry if that's not clearer. But those reform lines are absolutely crucial to what this movement teaches. You can't even understand Daniel 11:40 Part B without seeing a reform line begin in 1989 right here. That's what Adventism needs to recognise.